right, so before we get started, I think it's common at conferences to provide a little bit of a warning if a talk is going to have something not fun in it. So my talk is going to talk about the fire that happened here a couple years ago, and there's some traumatic stuff. So if that's not your thing, I might recommend checking out the breakfast downstairs. I'm going to be pretty gentle, but I figured it would be appropriate to mention it. So in the summer of 2020, our favorite year, my wife Caitlin and our dog Captain and I moved into a home that we spent a lot of time working towards having. And it's where we had planned to raise and start our family. Similar theme in my talk. This is about 5 miles from here in a town called Louisville. It's a suburb of Boulder. Yes, I was at that point in my life where moving to the suburbs was the dream. Looking at this photo, it feels almost like Norman Rockwell or something that it makes me think about how, for a lot of us in the industry, we're really comfortable, right? This is a privileged life, having a dog and a wife and a nice house somewhere beautiful like Boulder County. To be honest, I had nothing to worry about. Life was actually a little boring. Too bad. So that all changed about a year and a half later, at the very end of 2021. I was on a road trip down in San Diego, enjoying some time away from home. And we got in the car to drive back to Colorado. And I got this text message. This is from the Boulder County Sheriff telling me I needed to leave my house. And thankfully, I was not home. This is a little bit before 3 o'clock in the afternoon that day. And about 2 minutes later, I started getting motion notifications from the security camera on our front porch. And this was from falling ash, triggering the motion sensor. And I started getting a push notification every minute. So I pulled up on my phone, pulled over on the side of the road, and I looked at my air quality monitor, and this is in my office. It was not very good. The AWare assigns a score. I'd never seen red before. This number was 833, which is a PM 2.5, the standard measurement you see in your iPhone or whatever. This is actually almost the worst level ever observed on planet Earth, in a city outdoors. And this is inside my house, in my office. And that's because this is what was happening in my neighborhood. This house is 100 yards from mine, just north of here, or south of here. So I never actually saw any pictures from inside my neighborhood, and it's true actually to this day. But the following morning, I pulled up in Twitter, and I saw a really difficult video of my neighborhood. This is just about 100 of the 1,100 homes that burned down that afternoon. And it was actually a few days before the National Guard would let us back in. This is my wife and I standing in front of the same house you saw earlier. One thing that really sticks out to me is that 2 weeks after our house burned down, I realized, I took my dog out for a walk and I was like, wait, it's been 2 weeks since I've done this. What happened in the past 2 weeks? I literally hadn't even thought of doing something that I used to do 3 or 4 days before. And I noticed so many other things too. It was really hard for me to focus on anything. I got angry really, really easily. And something that started to become evident to me is that technology that I had used before was no longer going to work for me. I remember in particular losing my shit trying to solve one of these CAPTCHAs. I literally could not do it. I was clicking on buses and I would keep missing one, or clicking on something that wasn't a bus. And I had similar problems trying to operate 1Password, actually. What I soon learned after getting some help from a grief counselor at the Red Cross is that when you go through significant emotional trauma, it can actually cause brain damage. In my case, it was both temporary and permanent brain damage. So this experience really opened my eyes to that privilege that I had experienced before the disaster. It really changed the way I view the world more than anything else in my life. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And specifically, I'm going to talk about accessibility, which has a lot of definitions, but I like to provide one for the sake of our conversation. This one I really like from the Interaction Design Foundation says that accessibility is the concept of whether a product or service can be used by everyone however they encounter it. And I think that that's just such a nice way to describe the inclusivity of it. So in the past, I think like a lot of people, I'd imagined that people with disabilities were like really visible, people using wheelchairs or walking with a cane or something like that. But I've since this experience, I've really learned how disabilities come in many different forms, many of them invisible. And one framework for describing this is situational, temporary, and permanent disabilities. So for example, a permanent touch disability could be having one arm, as someone in the local Ruby community does. A temporary touch disability could be having a broken arm, and a situational touch disability could be, when I'm carrying my baby around the house and I only have one hand to do something, or maybe your hands are full carrying bags of groceries into your house. A permanent hearing disability would be being deaf. Temporary could be having an ear infection, and situational could be, working in a loud environment or, being in a bar or something like that. So when I couldn't complete CAPTCHAs, what I had was a temporary cognitive disability. Thankfully, it was not permanent. I can click on buses now. And throughout the accessibility world, there are lots of different guidelines and standards. I'm not going to get into any of them specifically. You've probably heard of like the WCAG, 508, APG. There's tons of them. They've made different versions. But in practice, you don't need to know specifically what they are. You just need to understand that accessibility is making it so that the things we build work with assistive technology. And while I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because assistive technology takes literally thousands of forms, in our work, at my job, we focus on screen readers. And screen readers are tools that read the screen out loud, and basically by navigating with a keyboard. So for example, if you're looking at this GitHub profile page, VoiceOver, which is the macOS screen reader, is going to announce each section of the page as the user navigates around with their keyboard. And what this means is that screen readers are effectively turning web pages back into code, and that they're making a tree structure out of them and allowing the user to navigate them on the keyboard. You can actually see this in practice. So if you go into the Chrome DevTools and click on accessibility, you can see the Chrome accessibility tree. I think this was an alpha feature a while back. I think it's just fully stable now. And this literally shows the tree structure of that same page that is navigated by a screen reader. So today I'm going to talk about how we've been taking this approach to improve how GitHub works for people using screen readers. And I'm going to share a couple of different areas and techniques. So the first one is automated scanning. The second is changing how we build forms. And the third is kind of a new UI development paradigm, at least in Rails, that we're calling preview-driven development. But that's a long introduction. I should introduce myself. My name is Joel. I am a staff engineer at GitHub, and I work on a lot of different UI-related things at the company. I'm probably the closest thing we have to a UI architect, although not very close. And right now, something that matters a lot to GitHub in terms of our user interface work is accessibility. So when I share details of what it's like to work at GitHub, I like to start by giving a rough idea of how big GitHub is, because I think it's helpful to calibrate what I'm saying to your individual situations. So GitHub has about 4,000 employees, and believe it or not, still we are a Ruby on Rails monolith. You might hear things that say that we aren't. We still are. Yeah. We serve billions of requests per day. I couldn't give you the exact number, but billions of requests out of our Rails monolith. We have about 1,400 Rails controllers. And what's amazing about that is that that's 25% more than we had last year. So that's how when people are asked, is Rails dead? I'm like, well, our GitHub got 25% bigger in Rails last year. It's not dead at GitHub, for sure. I love mentioning this stat. I try to include it every time I give a talk about GitHub because it really shows how much we continue to invest in Rails. That 25% is 350 controllers. How many Rails apps do you know that have 350? We added that in 1 year. The code base is like 15 years old. We got a couple million lines of Ruby. Another really helpful graph to show is that this is the number of lines of ERB in our code base over time. So you can see first commit was sometime it was actually late 2007, up until I just plot this through January. You can actually see the curve is steepening, which is scary for someone who works on UI practices at the company. You think GitHub's done, right? Like we got it figured out. We got the product is good, right? No, it's getting a lot bigger. So like I said, I think it's important to share this kind of context to talk when I start talking about like decisions we've made. So to understand how accessibility works at GitHub, I think it's important to share a little bit of history of the company, mainly because GitHub is a pretty weird spot. So the first 6 years GitHub was a company. Does anyone know what was weird about GitHub for the first 6 years? Let's see if anyone knows this, because there's probably some people who you're with. Okay, what do you think was the weirdest thing about GitHub, Paul? Hey, you're right. Yeah. So someone said no managers, and that was the weirdest thing about GitHub, I think, for the first 6 years. Paul might disagree. Yeah. I think that's pretty weird to have a company to go for that long without managers. But I think that like one part of that was something that manifested itself like actually in the architecture of the GitHub headquarters. So if you went to San Francisco and went to the GitHub headquarters, this is actually the entrance. It was a replica of the Oval Office from the White House. And this actually just went into storage. There was one of these in the Boulder office up until like the pandemic. This is what was on the floor. And this is really important. This rug said, the united meritocracy of GitHub. So for years, GitHub operated in what some people have called like a cooking for chefs mindset, which meant that like, since we were all software developers ourselves, we kind of knew what GitHub should be. And that meant that we could build whatever just sounded good to us and reasonably expect that like our customers would agree with us because we were kind of just like our customers. I honestly don't think that GitHub would have survived without managers if this wasn't the mindset the company was taking. But this approach, as you can imagine, had some downsides. I know of cases where we like literally turned down like deals that were worth at least $10 million because we literally couldn't find engineers to build what the customer like was requiring to sign a contract. Thankfully, a lot of has changed since then, though. Without feeling like a GitHub spokesperson, one of the tenets we have internally is trying to create GitHub to be the home for all developers. And that definition of all, we continue to try and expand as much as possible. And our statement on this is that we believe people with disabilities should benefit from and be able to contribute to the creation of human progress. And the reason why this is so important to us is that we see the role technology has in the future and recognize that if people with disabilities can't be part of the conversation in the process of building technology, that they're going to be left out of that future. And these are really big goals, especially for when we're trying to when our application is growing at like an ever increasing rate. What this means in practice for accessibility is that like we can't just go through all of GitHub and it's literally thousands of unique pages and fix each one to be accessible. Because even if we went that route, right, like it's like you'd immediately introduce regressions, right, like right in your path. So to achieve our goals, we realized pretty quickly that we needed great tools. So if you take, so one of those is automated accessibility scanning. And if you remember one thing from what I'm sharing today, hopefully it's not about the fire. Hopefully it's this. It's that bad accessibility, I'm just going to say, never breaks CI, like in traditional like application stack setups. Like one thing that has really scared me working on this coming into the industry is that like really nothing that I consider to be best practices that I learned up until working on accessibility actually led to accessible experiences. And that was really hard for me to see. So even when we do have like automated accessibility checks that we can put in CI, they're really imperfect. And this is like optimistic between 30 and 50% of accessibility issues can be caught using automated processes of any kind. This is like even including like the most modern, like highest tech research. So I can give a great example of this. So like, say we, we have a, this is a common linter, right? You say, okay, we gotta have alt text, right? That's a accessibility 101. If someone's using a screen reader, they probably can't see. They need to know what a picture is of. So you write some alt text and you say, my picture is of a cat sitting on a rock. Well, the problem is that it's a picture of a dog. And getting a computer to tell you that that alt text is wrong is very difficult. I've seen some people try to do it with AI object recognition and whatnot, but it's still not great. The issues get more subtle too. I have a graphic design background, actually a photography background. And something that's really common in graphic design is you use like visual techniques to communicate information. It's not just like words and images. It's like you literally use your visual design to say something. So for example, you might put like things that are to be compared in 2 columns versus in a large group. Well, someone who's visually impaired, they don't get that information from you. And I don't know how you'd write technology that would like catch that kind of accessibility problem. That all being said, with all those caveats, automated scanning can be really useful. And the main tool we use is Axe. This is kind of the industry standard. How many people here are familiar with Axe? Wow, this is great. I'm glad I'm doing this talk because Axe is awesome. Because it handles like a certain class of accessibility errors that like are gonna make your applications more accessible. This is great. You can run it a bunch of different ways. You can install it as a browser plugin, and it'll show you your violations in DevTools. So for example, yes, I'm going to pick on meetup.com. If you load Meetup when I did, you'd see there are 48 issues, and it actually goes down and lists the specific ones, including, yes, images must have alternative text. But the most effective thing we've done is you can actually run axes like just like JavaScript you drop on the page. And we have a script tag that gets toggled if you're in local development. And it highlights any violations visually in the application in red. So this basically means that if you're building something, you're gonna see it, it's gonna log in the console. At one point, we actually had it do an alert, like a JavaScript alert if you had an axe error. So just like really started to annoy people into fixing the bugs. I should have to turn that off. We actually also allow you, if you're a staff member, to add a little flag to your account, and then when you're using GitHub in production, you'll get all those errors as well. So get some feedback in your day-to-day. We also run the Axe suite in our end-to-end browser test environment, and this runs against every production deploy. So we use Playwright for our end-to-end suite, and basically that just says that like every time the page changes, which I believe triggers even on some like navigation events, we have check accessibility, which literally runs Axe and then fails if there are any errors that come up. We also write custom Axe rules. So like many applications, we have specific UI patterns that we use everywhere that can be misused, and we use it to lint the usage of those patterns. So for example, you guys have probably noticed on GitHub, our tooltips are custom. They're not like the browser ones. They're like black and they have like a little caret on them. Well, some people decide to put links in them, which is really, really inaccessible. So we actually have a custom Axe rule that says tooltips should only contain text, and that makes sure that that doesn't happen. But the unfortunate thing is that we've rolled out Axe at a pretty large scale, and while it solves some issues, it's also raised some really sticky ones. Because in some cases, we've run into parts of our application that weren't accessible from like a fundamental standpoint. And this is maybe the hardest thing to talk about when you bring up accessibility, especially at companies where it's like a new thing, is that people think it's something you can just go in and like make some small changes to a page. I'm literally talking about like we've had not even just pages, but like workflows that were multiple pages that had to be completely redesigned from scratch because of accessibility problems. I can give an example of this. Things like drag and drop are really hard. So like if you look at GitHub projects, we've now come out with a new version of projects. You wonder why? Just looking at this user interface, think about how you would say take a card and move it up and down in the column using only your keyboard. Can anyone tell me how they would do that?
Hit tab 1,000 times.
Yeah, a lot of tabbing. and hope that when you tab, say if you're blind, that your screen reader is telling you what's going on. It's almost impossible for that to be true. You can imagine like an automated scanner isn't going to tell you that. So despite all these downsides, Axe is still a great starting point. If you were to just like leave here today, go back to your companies and install Axe and resolve all the errors, you are doing more than 99% of people out there. And it will make your application more accessible by resolving those errors. And we generally start with Axe whenever we're trying to make a page accessible because it will help us get rid of the really obvious stuff. It'll also help us understand how bad the rest is going to be. So another critical tool in our accessibility work has been changing the way we work on forms. So I don't need to tell this crowd that forms are what Rails is all about. If you go back to the original Build a Blog in 15 Minutes demo from what, like this is like almost 18 years old now. Most of the demo is just building forms. And then if you look 15 years later, look at the demo, the 15-minute demo for Hotwire, guess what it is? It's building forms. So I don't know about you guys, but I think Rails, it's something Rails should be excellent at. And I would argue that it's very good at building forms. We have great tools. We have form tag, form for, form with. Does anyone know the difference between the three of those? Form with is actually both form tag and form for, I believe. That's the way it was explained to me, at least. So anyways, when it comes to forms, I'll give an example here from the actual Rails guides. So this example is showing form with, what you call in your template, and what it actually outputs. And what I think this example from the guides makes really clear is that it's pretty much a mapping from Ruby calls into DOM nodes. This is really great. It simplifies a ton of complexity, and it gives you tools for like adding select options to a form, for example. But unfortunately isn't accessible by default. So if we look at this example code, you can see that the form input, the text field, form.text field, has an associated label, right? And they have that matching query symbol argument. This example is great because it actually is accessible. This passes one of the Axe rules, which is 4.4, which reads that you should programmatically associate labels with all form controls, keyword all. And the recommended method is to use the label element and an explicit association using the for and ID attributes. So if we look at our example code here, you can see that it actually does this correctly. And the outputted values, label for query, input ID query. Great, so we pass Axe. The problem is that you have to remember to do this. And in my experience, not a lot of people do. So as the Axe rule stated, all of our form controls need labels. This isn't a compromise. Yeah, in Rails, it's only an option for you to do that. So Drew knows this book. We talked about this last night. I'll make one book recommendation today. This is my favorite software engineering book of all time. This is called A Philosophy of Software Design. I also think it has the best programming book cover ever. This is what it talks about, is taking your spaghetti code and untangling it. And one of the chapters that really resonated with me when I was working on this problem was chapter 10, which is titled, Define Errors Out of Existence. And the premise is really just that like you can make your software a lot better by making things that are invalid impossible. So when we were working on forms at our scale, we wanted to think about ways that we could define certain accessibility errors out of existence. So luckily for me, we had just hired a new engineer on our team, and he was curious to have a new problem to work on. And I said, hey, Cameron, what would it look like if we took our Rails form builder and made it accessible by default? So what he did, if we look at our previous example, is he wrote a new DSL. He actually made application form to make it feel Railsy. And he made a new DSL that, what I'll really highlight here is that he made one method to create a text field that also constructed the label. And what that allowed us to do is automatically generate the input and label tags, linking them correctly and making sure that that Axe rule is satisfied 100% of the time. So in effect, what we've done here is we've just made that Axe error difficult, if not impossible, to violate by creating better abstractions around form building. And while it's not possible to like do this for every Axe violation, we've actually gotten down like a pretty extensive list and written these kinds of abstractions that are accessible by default. So what this work has really taught us is that by focusing on creating these accessible abstractions, it's actually helped us have maybe the best answer yet for the age-old question of what makes a good UI component, which is like one of the #1 things that a UI engineer is asked. And I'll give a great example of this. So in our design system, like most, we have an avatar component, and you've seen these everywhere in GitHub. There's like thousands of them. This avatar most of the time links to the user's profile pages. If you click on it, it goes there. You might also hover over it and you get that little hover card that displays more information about the person. The problem is that we tended to use it next to a text link to the user's profile. And sometimes we'd have a hover card on that too. So especially if you're using a screen reader, you could imagine if you're tabbing through this, you'd tab onto the image and it would say alt text user Joel Hawksley. And then maybe it would trigger the hover card, and then you tab again and it'd say Joel Hawksley. So basically be duplicate. And that's something that like a lot of people with screen readers will complain about, is that when they're navigating through the page, they actually have a more verbose experience, which can be really taxing on their usage of an application. So we decided is to make this pattern accessible, we would actually make a new component that was an accessible version of that common accessible problem. We called this a nameplate, which contains an avatar and the text link. And then we made sure that the combination of the two was accessible and in an ideal form as possible for screen readers. And then I don't want to say we've rolled it out everywhere, but we've rolled it out a lot in a lot of the application. So if you want to see this, I didn't put a link in the slide, but the primer view components repository has the entire forms framework in it. It's actually all open source. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is what I'm calling preview-driven development. And if y'all do a lot of React work, maybe this is not a huge surprise to you. But in the Rails world, we have this like really old part of Rails. How many people here have used action mailer previews? Okay, you're gonna know where this is. You might know where this is going then. Action mailer previews kind of give you a local URL. It's at /Rails mailers. And it will let you like look at your emails in a local environment instead of having to futz with like a fake mailer. So when we build our UI components, we write previews for them as well. So an example for this is, here we have like a button being rendered in isolation. You can see the URL is Rails view components, primer beta button, and it's cut off, but it says danger there, which is our danger button. And in our simplest form, our previews look a lot like mailer previews, which are kind of controllers a little bit. But this one renders that button. And for our button component, we might have a preview for each color scheme, maybe different functional modes. And then we use those previews in our tests. So what we do is we have a helper that renders the preview, and then it binds it into Capybara under the hood and allows you to run Capybara assertions in your test. So we can run UI tests. This actually doesn't even involve a browser, and at least in this case, and these tests are really, really fast. But if you want to involve a browser for a system test, we just write visit preview instead of render preview. What's been really fascinating about this workflow has been how much it started to blur the line in between writing code for tests and writing code for local development. What we've ended up doing is consolidating like all of our test case examples into previews. So our test cases actually don't have as much UI setup code. Our previews have it. So when you write a preview, we'll write a preview when we design our component, and then when we go to test it, we'll use render preview or visit preview. And we've seen a ton of benefits from going this direction. It makes your UI tests easier to debug because if you get an error, you can actually just open the preview in a browser. You don't need to like stop your browser-driven test and like inspect Chrome driver or whatever. So if we go back to the test of that button, say we misspell the selector, we're going to get a failure, and instead of having to boot the test in a browser, or if we're doing just a unit test digging through like the rendered HTML body, we can just open that URL that we were just at in Chrome, and we can inspect the element and use all of our Chrome developer tools. One nice thing about this is that previews also make our components really easy to discover. You could imagine that I think we have 1,500 people committing to our monolith right now, maybe a little bit more than that. It's easy for everyone to know what everyone else is working on. And actually, we occasionally have 2 people in the company or 2 teams in the company end up building the same component, which is a little awkward. So what we do is we use a tool called Lookbook to organize our previews. And it basically creates like a component directory. In fact, this is a screenshot of the one internal to the GitHub monolith. And you can browse it in local development. And this effectively is basically what Storybook is in React. But Lookbook is a re-implementation of it using Hotwire, which I think is pretty slick. What this also does, to take it one step further, is it's not just coupling our development environment to our test environment, it's also creating our documentation. So this gives us an incentive to write test cases that exercise our UI in practical ways, right? Because the previews that are then created for those test cases become the documentation for our UI. In fact, this has been so effective that if you go to the Primer Design System website, we just recently rebuilt it, and we don't even have like handwritten documentation anymore. We just say, hey, go look at the previews, because they're going to be up to date, because they're derived from the test suite. But perhaps most importantly, for the sake of talking about accessibility, this workflow really leads developers towards running their components through X, because we've added it to our Lookbook configuration. So now when you're in Lookbook looking at a component, we can actually see all the X results. We also go through and iterate all of our previews and run X against them in CI on every build. So this workflow is one of the reasons why people, and probably some of you here, love working in React and not in Rails for your UI, is that it really enables a lot of this kind of integration in the UI development process. But now we can do it in Rails, and I think this is a great example of how we can continue to improve the Rails UI ecosystem using ideas from the React ecosystem. So in the accessibility practice, there's a term called universal design. Does anyone here know what universal design is? Yes, no one. Sweet. So universal design is the idea that when you make something usable for people with disabilities, that accessibility accommodations, they don't just benefit people with disabilities, they benefit everyone. So a real world example of this is curb cuts, right? This blows my mind, but curb cuts used to not be a thing. And that was actually like maybe 50, 60 years ago. Like it's a very recent invention that we have the curb cut at a crossing. They were originally, I think, pretty obviously meant for wheelchair users, but now as a new parent who pushes a stroller, I really appreciate them too. And they actually benefit just like normal people who might not have like a very healthy gait. You don't have to lift your foot up as high. And I think we can learn a lot from this mindset of universal design. What might it look like in software? It might mean, you think this is a bad example. This is actually a good example, believe it or not. Let me explain. And I actually think that the laughter here is indicative of maybe we're like, let's just look at this from another side. Think about back to my story earlier. Why did I have to do a CAPTCHA? It's because I wasn't trusted. It's because the application didn't know who I was. So SSO is actually an accessibility feature. This application is super accessible to me in that state when I'm in a high trauma, high emotional load situation, because I can just click sign in with Apple and my phone will look at my face and I'm in. I don't need to click on any buses or anything. In fact, I used to scoff at seeing this, but I have since used sign in with Apple and sign in with Google and whatnot so much more, because I don't have to go through that process of trying to get one password to remember the login, trying to click on buses or whatever. I feel like the CAPTCHAs are actually getting harder these days. Yeah, it reminds me of the trash cans at Yosemite, that they have to make them harder and harder for the bears. Right? makes it harder for me to put trash in them. But perhaps the bigger lesson I've learned working on this problem is that accessibility is really just an example of a larger class of problems, really blind spots that we have as able, wealthy, first world software developers. It reminds me of maybe the most famous thing Donald Rumsfeld ever said. I'm gonna see if I can get this right. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history, it is the latter category that tends to be the difficult ones. And let me give you a practical example of this. Even amongst our customer base at GitHub that skews towards users of more powerful hardware, the experience we have using our products is not the same as our customers. So this is a benchmark. Actually, DHH shared this on Twitter. This is from late 2021. GitHub issues every engineer an iPhone 13 Pro, or it did at the time. The fastest Android phone you could buy is the Samsung S21. So this is a JavaScript benchmark, which meant that when we were developing our JavaScript applications, we were experiencing them at a significantly different level of performance than like any customer that was using Android. And for security reasons, we only use iPhones. We don't use Androids. You can imagine this creates a very different perception of our customers' experience. And a similar issue exists with request latency. So most GitHub traffic is served from, actually most traffic period is served from US East 1, which means that our US-based staff does not experience the lag time our customers in Australia do. For example, we have now virtual points of presence that mitigate this to a certain extent, but that disproportionately affects usage of single-page applications. It affects things like WebSockets. There's a lot of specific things that like request latency, you might be blind to working really close in physical proximity to your servers. So how do we look out for these blind spots? How do we find these unknown unknowns? I think that what I've given a lot of examples of today is that we can find them by embedding empathy into our engineering practices. And it really starts by putting ourselves in the shoes of people other than ourselves. The more different from us, the better. Thank you. So I'll end on a happy note. This is the picture I showed earlier. I put my drone up on Monday. That's what it looks like. So I think about 60% of the lots are being rebuilt right now. Mine is in the top right corner. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah. We suck at accessibility, guys. We are terrible. No, I mean this completely seriously. This is not a joke. As an industry, we are terrible at this. Like, I don't want to paint some rosy picture. Like, what we're doing at GitHub is just to like not suck. It's not to be good at it. It's to not suck at it. Like the industry standard, like I think the thing that has been so sobering for me working on this is like because we don't have a lot of blind people who work at GitHub, we've had to hire blind people to work with us to tell us how much we suck at accessibility. And I've been moved to tears on multiple occasions watching someone use my software. Yeah. So if there's anything that I would say is like, take that perspective, right? Like actually try and watch someone use your software and watch them struggle to like, remember the SSO option, right? Maybe you can help them like, when they try and sign in with Facebook and you see like, okay, well, your Facebook email's this. We actually saw you tried to sign in with GitHub with that. Like, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, so question number one is, are emojis accessible? The question is, the answer is it depends. I'd say they're becoming more, like most things, the browsers are getting better at making things more natively accessible, but I would say that like our practice is to not use them. Yeah, or like if you use them, you have to provide alternatives. Like that's why you get like a limited set in a lot of cases in GitHub. Second question was, remind me, I've already forgotten.
How do you champion it?
Oh, how do you champion accessibility? Okay, so That's actually the talk I'm going to write for next year, but I can give you kind of a preview of how I think it's become successful for us. Step one, we got sued. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that I think that that's actually like the thing that I'll probably be talking about more plainly when I have more time to think about it and write it up, is that like you will get sued. There's so much precedence. Like, I'm surprised that someone, how do I say this politely? You could probably write an axe scanner that just scanned the top like 10,000 web pages, looked for accessibility errors, and filed lawsuits. I'm surprised it isn't happening already. And if it hasn't, it probably will. Like, think about like, I'll give you an analogy that has actually been useful that might be a more helpful answer to y'all. Replace, anytime you work on, anytime you've like thought about security, replace the word security with accessibility, and you'll probably be true. So like if you say, oh, there was someone who was like a threat actor who exploited a security vulnerability. Well, I think we're going to pretty soon see legal threat actors that exploit accessibility vulnerabilities. And I think that one of the ways that this has been really helpful is that we have our head of accessibility for the company. We hired him. His name's Ed, and he is blind, and he is a lawyer. and he's our head of accessibility for GitHub. And you know what? Things are happening. Yeah. You know, we've had budget cuts lately, but you know what? Somehow the money just always appears for Ed. Yeah. It's just always, sometimes there's always money for him. So I think that, like, you know, I had a great conversation with Drew last night about what it means to be perfect in software, like what is good enough in software. And I think that what we started talking about was how like the business ultimately needs to care if like it's gonna happen. So I think that has been like the real turning point for GitHub, has been like, we just put it purely in business sense, which is like, you know, we have legal issues, we have legal risk issues. If you can start to put it in those terms, to be like, okay, we're gonna get sued if we don't have alt text. Like, I think that one of the ways we thought about this in practice is like, one of the things I built is I built an axe scanner that went through our DNS records, which we keep on under source control, and it visited every single host. We have like 100 domains at GitHub, and it visited every single domain, and it ran axe and reported the results, with the thinking that it'd be pretty easy to like say we don't care about accessibility if we can't even pass axe. So what we've been doing now is we actually have that report for the whole company, and we're like, okay, we got to get that down to 0, right? Because like, it'd be pretty easy for someone to make the argument like you didn't even try, right? If you didn't even run an automated scanner. So like, if y'all take anything out of this today, is go home, go back to work, put axe and CI on all your main public, at least non-logged in pages, and make sure it's green, right? Like, I think that is probably gonna like take a lot of risk off the table. And I think that you'd probably get pretty easy buy-in at your company to be like, okay, give me like a month to go do this, you know? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Where do you find axe?
What?
Where do you find axe?
It's by a company called DQ. It's free. Just search for axe, AXE, accessibility scanner or whatever. It's like the industry standard. There are others, if they fit your workflow, great. They all kind of do the same thing. But axe is pretty standard. They also have a huge stack. If you want to start giving them money, they can help you solve your accessibility problems pretty well. They can go through and write custom rules for you. It's great. We contract with DQ as well. They also have developer education, so if you want to like get your developers up to speed on accessibility, you can pay them, and they'll provide the right resources and webinars and all that stuff. They're really solid. It's so bright up here. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Just curious, does Axe run on mobile clients as well?
Oh, like for iOS?
Yeah.
No, like does it run on like iOS apps? Is what I'm saying. Like mobile apps. Oh gosh, you know, this is actually, so I'm on paternity leave right now. We just had our kid, and I don't know. That was actually something we were just going to start to look into, because we have this like multi-year process we're doing to like really right the ship. I know that they have tools. I don't know if they're free. That's probably the best answer. And mobile accessibility is an entirely different game. I will say that generally the situation's better, because at least if on iOS, a lot of Apple's built-in UI tools that most people use do have accessibility accommodations, which is really great. It's actually why I think you see a lot of the accessibility community focusing on mobile platforms more, because the UI frameworks are more, they're more abstracted than they are like on the web. You can do whatever you want, but like iOS, if you use Swift UI, it's like a much narrower set of tools. Anyone else? Cool. Thank y'all.